While he should have been shoveling after the snowstorm, Don was glued to the couch all weekend because he was repeatedly watching Wild Things, the steamy 90s thriller starring Nev Campbell and Denise Richards. I haven't watched it yet, but Don won't stop yapping about how it's his absolute favorite movie of all time. And if I'm being honest, I'm not so sure I buy it. For one, he only watches it when he's home alone. And for two, yeah, he says it's his favorite movie, but for some reason he's never watched anything after that one scene in the swimming pool that everyone talks about. Anyways, his wife and kids got snowed in at Cousin Barry's for the weekend. But now that the roads are mostly clear, they're finally heading home. The only problem is that the driveway and steps are still completely untouched. Donny Boy hasn't shoveled a thing, and to make matters worse, the sun melted just enough of the snow to create a slick sheet of ice. So it's perfect for ice skating, I suppose, if that's what you're into, of course. Don knew his family would be home in just a few hours, and the clock was ticking. The driveway was a disaster, the steps were a hazard, and he hadn't done a single thing to fix it. If he didn't act fast, he was going to have some serious explaining to do. He needed a good plan, and he needed it now. Don scratched his head, squinting at the driveway, now gleaming in the pale winter sunlight like some kind of amateur ice skating rink. He sighed deeply, the kind of sigh that could only come from a man who definitely spent too much time alone with the DVD of Wild Things. The time for procrastination had passed. It was now the time for action. And by action, I mean overthinking every step of a relatively simple task. First, he would need his snowsuit. A simple enough starting point, or so it seemed. Don bolted into the bedroom closet and began rifling through the hanging garments with a kind of grim determination. It's here somewhere, he muttered to himself, pulling out what appeared to be his snowsuit, but it was just his wife's old ski jacket from 1998. It was purple with lime green accents. It looked like something you'd find on clearance at a thrift store for ironic fashion statements. Finally, after several minutes of unnecessarily loud hangers clanking around, Don emerged with his snowsuit in hand. It smelled faintly of last year's dryer sheets. However, as he began to wrestle his way into it, an obstacle presented itself. The zipper made it only halfway up before the suit stretched tight across his midsection. She must have shrunk it in the dryer, he grumbled to himself, while tugging at the zipper. His tone was accusatory, aimed squarely at his wife, who clearly had a vendetta against his winter wardrobe. It's because she put it on high heat again. Eventually, he gave up on the zipper and decided the partially closed snowsuit would have to do. He looked a bit like a deflated mascot, but at least he was suited up. Next on the agenda was a shovel. Don's favorite shovel, a sturdy plastic one with an ergonomically designed arch handle for optimal leverage. It was also nowhere to be seen. He vaguely remembered lending it to someone, possibly neighbor Steve, or maybe it was his brother-in-law who never returned anything on time. Regardless, it wasn't in its rightful place in the garage. What he did find was a child-sized shovel, the kind that might be included in a Peach Play set. Its cheerful yellow plastic blade and red handle did little to inspire confidence. Well, this is just great, Don muttered to himself while holding the miniature shovel up for inspection. What am I supposed to do with this? Build the sandcastle? He chuckled dryly at his own joke, but the sound echoed awkwardly in the empty garage. Undeterred, he pressed on, determined to execute his plan to perfection despite the inferior tools at his disposal. Don walked back to the driveway, the tiny shovel clutched in one gloved hand, and surveyed the ice-coated expanse. It was time to strategize. Shoveling a driveway was not a task to be approached haphazardly. Oh no, not for Don. He prided himself on his methodical approach to all things, even menial household chores. First, he decided he'd tackle the stairs. Safety first, after all. He would start with the top step and chip away at the ice with small, precise jabs, then move systematically downward. This would ensure that no step above him remained icy, minimizing the risk of slipping and falling into a heap on the driveway below. He even visualized the process, imagining himself as a kind of winter warrior hacking away at a frozen enemy with his trusty, yet laughably inadequate weapon. Once the stairs were clear, he'd move on to the driveway itself. Dom planned to divide it into quarters and tackle each one individually. This approach, he reasoned, would prevent him from becoming overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the task. He also decided he'd shovel in a zigzag pattern, rather than straight lines, a technique he believed would distribute his energy more evenly and reduce fatigue. Not that he had any scientific evidence to back this up, but it sounded pretty good in his head. Don paused to consider the time. His family would be home in just a few hours, and he couldn't afford to waste time. He needed to execute his plan with military precision, or as close to military precision as one could manage while wielding a toy-sized shovel. "All right, let's do this," he said to himself, puffing out his chest as much as the tight snowsuit would allow. And with that, Don began. His first attempt to scrape the ice from the top step produced a pitiful squeaking sound, like a mouse protesting its untimely eviction. The shovel barely made a dent in the ice. Undeterred, Don applied more force, his movements growing increasingly exaggerated and dramatic. If anyone had been watching, they might have mistaken him for a man performing some kind of interpretive dance. By the time he had cleared the first step, a task that took far longer than it had any right to, and Don was already winded. He glanced back at the driveway, which glistened mockingly in the sunlight, and felt a pang of regret. Perhaps he should have started this whole process before binge-watching Wild Things for the umpteenth time. But no, there was no use dwelling on the past. Don was a man on a mission. Plus, he really likes that movie and refused to feel guilty for doing something he loved. And so, he continued, step by painstaking step, quadrant by quadrant, determined to clear the driveway before his family arrived home, or at least to make it look like he tried. Don stood at the top step. He leaned heavily on the tiny shovel, much like an exhausted knight who just came home from battle. His breath polluted the air as he surveyed the barely cleared step beneath him, a pitiful patch of wet concrete surrounded by glistening ice. His arms ached, his back twinged, and he could already feel the beginnings of a blister forming on his palm, even through his thick winter gloves. And yet, he had 6 more steps to go before even thinking about the driveway. He sighed, a long theatrical sigh that sounded more like a balloon slowly deflating than an expression of genuine resolve. Don couldn't help but wonder, was it worth it? Sure, his wife would give him an earful if she came home to a snow-covered driveway. He could already hear her voice in his head yapping at him about why he didn't shovel over the weekend and demanding to know what he was doing the entire time. And there was no good answer to that. Watching Wild Things again, one scene in particular would be more accurate, wasn't going to win him any points. And then there were the kids. His daughters would probably roll their eyes and mutter something about him being lazy and always putting things off. But Tommy, his 7-year-old son, wouldn't understand. Tommy would look up at him with those big trusting eyes and say something crushingly innocent, like, "Dad, why didn't you want us to come home?" Don shook his head. He wasn't ready for that level of guilt yet. Still, the thought of shoveling the rest of the stairs and the entire driveway seemed like a Herculean task. He glanced around the neighborhood. Surely there were some local kids who'd jump at the chance to earn a few bucks for shoveling a little snow. He could just pop his head outside and shout, "Hey kids, $10 to clear my driveway," and probably have a team of teenagers on the job within minutes. But then he thought about it a little more. $10, that's 2 $5 bills. That's at least 3 cups of very weak gas station coffee. The kind that tastes more like ashtray water than anything else. It's so weak that it likely counts as decaf. And what if they didn't do a good job? Or what if they expected more money? He wasn't about to negotiate snow clearing rates with middle schoolers. No, hiring kids was out of the question. He was too cheap for that, plain and simple. For a brief, tantalizing moment, Don considered faking a back injury. He could already picture himself stretched out on the couch when his wife and kids walked in, one hand dramatically pressed to his lower back, a grimace etched across his face. It'd say something like, "Oh, honey, I was just about to shovel, but I tweaked something. Might have slipped a disc when I was lifting that one really heavy box in the garage that I told you we should get rid of." It honestly wasn't a bad plan. It even had a touch of plausibility to it. But then he thought about the logistics. How long would he have to keep up the act? A day? A week? He'd have to groan every time he stood up and maybe even drag his leg a little for effect. And what if his wife insisted he see a doctor? No, the fake injury route was too risky. He'd never be able to sell it. His mind wandered to another idea. Tommy. Sure, Tommy was only 7, but Don had seen him swing that firm baseball bat with surprising vigor. The kid had potential. Maybe this was the perfect opportunity to toughen him up a bit, teach him the value of hard work. They could even frame it as a father-son bonding moment. Tommy, let's tackle this together. But even Don had to admit this was a stretch. For one, Tommy would probably just end up playing in the snow, leaving Don to do all the work anyway. For two, there was a decent chance Tommy would end up face first in the driveway, and that was a scenario Don definitely didn't want to explain to his wife. Which left only one option: just get it over with. Don sighed again. A deep, soul-wrenching sigh that seemed to echo across the frozen landscape. He looked down at the tiny shovel in his hands, its cheerful yellow blade mocking him. There was no cavalry coming, no shortcut, no magical solution. It was just him, the ice, and a whole lot of manual labor. All right, he muttered to himself, straightening up and trying to muster some semblance of resolve. Let's do this. He shuffled back to the top step and began chipping away at the ice, his movements slow and deliberate. The shovel made a faint scraping sound as it skidded across the surface, occasionally sending small chunks of ice flying. It wasn't efficient, and it definitely wasn't elegant, but it was progress. And as much as Don hated every second of it, he had to admit there was something satisfying about seeing the bare concrete emerge beneath the ice, inch by painstaking inch. By the time he reached the bottom step, his back ached, his arms felt like jelly, and he was pretty sure he'd lost all feeling in his toes. But the stairs were clear. For the first time all weekend, he felt a small sense of accomplishment. Now came the driveway. Don looked at the expanse of ice before him and groaned. This was going to take a while. But at least now he had a system. Sections, zigzags, and a tiny shovel that was far from ideal, but starting to feel like an old friend. He took a deep breath, adjusted his gloves, and stepped onto the driveway, ready to face the next chapter of his snow saga. Don was halfway through the first quadrant of the driveway, and already felt like he had climbed Mount Everest. Twice. The ice clung stubbornly to the pavement, each scrape of the shovel yielding only a few pitiful flakes of progress. He paused to catch his breath, leaning on the child-sized shovel as if it were a staff supporting a weary traveler. His breath came in short wheezing bursts, each exhale visible in the frigid air. He took off one glove and flexed his fingers, which were beginning to feel like frozen sausages. Then he shook out his forearms, wincing at the burning sensation creeping up his muscles. "Got to pace myself," he muttered, although pacing himself only seemed to prolong the misery. He tried switching his grip on the shovel to see if that helped, but all it did was make his wrists hurt in new ways. Scrape, wheeze, shake, repeat. Scrape, wheeze, shake, repeat. The routine was as monotonous as it was exhausting, and Don couldn't help but wonder how he'd let things get so out of hand. He could have shoveled right after the blizzard. He could have done it in stages. But no, he just had to spend the weekend glued to the couch, reliving wild things on an endless loop. And then, like a beam of sunlight piercing through storm clouds, a thought hit him. They aren't home yet. Don froze, the shovel dangling limply from his gloved hands. He checked his watch. Sure enough, he still had at least an hour before his wife and kids were due to arrive. Which meant he was still home alone, which meant he could take a quick break. The idea took root in his mind and sprouted with alarming speed. After all, he was exhausted, wasn't he? His forearms felt like they were on fire, his lungs were screaming for oxygen, and his back was staging a minor rebellion. Surely he deserved a little rest. Just a few minutes to recharge. And what better way to recharge than by watching his favorite scene from Wild Things? It would be the perfect pick-me-up. He rationalized it further. He'd been making progress. The steps were clear. He had the quadrant system in place. He'd earned this. Besides, he wouldn't be long. Just a quick breather, and then he'd get right back to work. Don dropped the shovel and shuffled toward the house, moving with the urgency of a man on a mission. Within moments, he was back in the living room, DVD remote in hand. He skipped through the opening credits, past the courtroom scenes, and straight to the part he knew by heart. There it was, the swimming pool scene, the lighting, the music, the tension. It was cinematic perfection. Don flopped onto the couch, and then, just as quickly as it started, the break was over. Not even 2 minutes had passed before Don turned the TV off, stood up, and returned the remote to its rightful place. It was a very, very quick break. As he trudged back outside, the cold air hit him like a slap in the face, jolting him out of his brief moment of indulgence. The driveway stretched out before him, an unyielding expanse of ice and misery. But something had shifted in Don's demeanor. Maybe it was the brief reprieve, or maybe it was the knowledge that he was running out of time. But he picked up the shovel with renewed determination. "All right, let's finish this," he muttered to himself. Don froze, the shovel dangling limply from his gloved hands. He checked his watch. Sure enough, he still had at least an hour before his wife and kids were due to arrive. Which meant he was still home alone, which meant he could take a quick break. The idea took root in his mind and sprouted with alarming speed. After all, he was exhausted, wasn't he? His forearms felt like they were on fire, his lungs were screaming for oxygen, and his back was staging a minor rebellion. Surely he deserved a little rest. Just a few minutes to recharge. And what better way to recharge than by watching his favorite scene from Wild Things? It would be the perfect pick-me-up. He rationalized it further. He'd be making progress. The steps were clear. He had a quadrant system in place. He'd earned this. Besides, he wouldn't be long. Just a quick break, and then he'd get right back to work. Don dropped the shovel and shuffled toward the house, moving with the urgency of a man on a mission. Within moments, he was back in the living room, DVD remote in hand. He skipped through the opening credits, past the courtroom scenes, and straight to the part he knew by heart. There it was, the swimming pool scene, the lighting, the music, the tension. It was cinematic perfection. Don flopped onto the couch, and then, just as quickly as it started, the break was over. Not even 2 minutes had passed before Don turned the TV off, stood up, and returned the remote to its rightful place. It was a very, very quick break. As he trudged back outside, the cold air hit him like a slap in the face, jolting him out of his brief moment of indulgence. The driveway stretched out before him, an unyielding expanse of ice and misery. But something had shifted in Don's demeanor. Maybe it was the brief reprieve, or maybe it was the knowledge that he was running out of time. But he picked up the shovel with renewed determination. "All right, let's finish this," he muttered to himself. Don attacked the driveway with what he believed was an unparalleled display of effort. The kind of effort that would earn other dads medals, accolades, and possibly a feature story in some suburban dad hall of fame. His boots crunched on the slick ice as he bent his knees, braced his back, and thrust the child-sized shovel forward. He grunted with each scrape, each pitiful scoop of ice, fully convinced that his Herculean labor would inspire awe and gratitude for generations to come. He imagined his wife arriving home, marveling at his dedication. Wow, Don, you really went above and beyond. And his kids would talk about this day for years, telling their own families about the time their dad battled a blizzard's aftermath with nothing but sheer grit and a shovel barely larger than a soup ladle. But in reality, Don was doing the bare minimum, and not even particularly well. The shovel was too small, the ice too stubborn, and Don's technique, if you could call it that, was wildly inefficient. He scraped at odd angles, chipped away in random patches, and took frequent breaks to shake out his arms or lean on the shovel dramatically, like some tragic hero in an unwritten Shakespearean play titled Don versus Winter. As the minutes dragged on, Don began to feel a growing sense of triumph. Surely he must be making significant progress by now. Surely the driveway was nearly cleared, and his family would return to find a pristine winter wonderland free of ice and snow. He stopped to wipe his brow, despite the fact that it was far too cold for actual sweat, and turned to survey his hard work. His heart sank. He was maybe, just maybe, a quarter of the way done. A thin strip of pavement, barely wide enough for a bicycle tire, stretched from the edge of the driveway toward the garage. The rest of the driveway was just as ice-covered and untouched as it had been when he started. And worse still, the clock was ticking. He checked his watch. Just over an hour until his wife and kids would pull up in their salt-streaked minivan. They'd find him standing there, shovel in hand, looking like the very picture of futility. Don felt a cold sweat, or maybe just the chill of the wind creaked down his back. Damage control. That was the only option now. He couldn't clear the whole driveway in time, not at this rate. But maybe he could clear just enough. He pivoted his focus, narrowing his scope to the one part of the driveway that mattered most, the path where his wife's car would park. If he could just carve out a narrow strip, enough for her to pull in without sliding into a snowbank, that would count as a win, wouldn't it? Sure, there wouldn't be any wiggle room, but hey, she'd be able to park. That was what mattered, right? Don set to work with renewed purpose. His movements were frantic and erratic now, a man racing against time, though the shovel's tiny blade meant progress remained agonizingly slow. Each scoop of snow and ice was like trying to empty a swimming pool with a teaspoon. He muttered to himself as he worked, alternating between self-congratulation and self-pity. The shovel's handle dug into his gloves, and his forearms burned with the fire of 1,000 unpaid gym memberships. Still, he pressed on, driven by the dual forces of looming responsibility and sheer desperation. And yet, even as he worked, the thought crept back into his mind. There's still time for one last break. It was a dangerous thought, seductive in its simplicity. He checked his watch again. 50 minutes. He could shovel for 45 more minutes and still sneak inside to watch his favorite scene from Wild Things just one more time. Just a quick mental reset before his family arrived. No, he shook his head to banish the thought. No more breaks. Got to finish this. The thought persisted. After all, didn't he deserve a little reward for his hard work? He was out here freezing, laboring, suffering. Surely, a brief reprieve wouldn't hurt. Just 2 minutes. 3, tops. He looked at the driveway and back at the house. The pull of the warm living room, the soft couch, the glowing TV screen was almost too much to resist. He glanced at his watch again. 49 minutes now. Don sighed. Fine, he muttered, dropping the shovel and trudging toward the house. One last Wild Things break. Just a quick one, really quick. He rushed inside, grabbed the remote, and like always, he skipped straight to the pool scene. The movie started playing, and like always, it was over before it started. Don threw himself back into shoveling with the determination of a man whose very survival depended on it. Each thrust of the tiny shovel felt like an act of defiance against the cruel forces of nature. His arms burned, His back screamed in protest, and his knees popped ominously with every squat. But he pushed through, telling himself that greatness often comes with great pain. Then, with a sound that could only be described as heartbreak in shovel form, it happened. The tiny red handle snapped clean in two. Don stood there, quite literally frozen, staring at the jagged plastic edges as if they'd personally betrayed him. He shook the broken pieces in his gloved hands, willing them to magically reassemble. They didn't. He cursed under his breath, though not too loudly. There were kids next door, and he didn't want them to hear a grown man losing an argument with an inanimate object. Duct tape, he muttered. Duct tape fixes everything. He stomped off toward the garage, his boots crunching angrily on the snow. After a brief but frantic search through his chaotic tool bench, he found a roll of duct tape and set to work. Wrapping the handle like his life depended on it, he mumbled words of encouragement to himself. This'll do. Good as new. Maybe even better. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. The first time he tried to shovel again, the duct tape gave way with a pathetic snap. The handle dangled uselessly, held together by nothing but misplaced optimism and a few stubborn strands of adhesive. Tom stood there, defeated. The driveway remained mostly untouched, a glistening reminder of his failure. He was doomed. His wife was going to take one look at this mess and go nuclear. He could already hear her voice. Don, what have you been doing all day? Have you been watching Wild Things again? He shuffled over to the house, his head hanging low, and caught his reflection in the living room window. His snowsuit was unzipped and lopsided, his gloves hung limply from his fingers, and his face was a mixture of exhaustion and resignation. Well, he said to himself, you better make a good first impression. He practiced a few greetings, trying to strike the right balance between cheerful and apologetic. Hey, honey, how was the drive? Roads weren't too bad, I hope. No, too chipper. She'd see right through it. Welcome home. I've been hard at work out here all day. Too obvious a lie. Hey, kids, who wants hot chocolate? Better, but risky. The lack of a clear driveway might undercut his enthusiasm. After a few more failed attempts, Dom gave up. Nothing he said was going to save him now. He might as well start mentally preparing for the inevitable punishment. No good snacks, no tea nights, definitely no couch time. He'd be relegated to eating unsalted crackers in the kitchen, while the family enjoyed pizza and movies in the living room. The shame would be unbearable. Just as he was spiraling into thoughts of exile, his phone buzzed. He fumbled it out of his pocket and read the message from his wife. Be home in 5 minutes. He scrambled to think. He couldn't let them pull into the driveway and see him standing there doing nothing. He had to look busy. He dashed into the garage, grabbing random items and moving them around with a theatrical flair. An old rake. He leaned it against the wall like it had just been in use. A bag of birdseed. He showed it around for no reason before setting it on the shelf. At one point, he even grabbed a bucket and stared into it like he was checking for something important. A bolt or something that like. His heart raced as he glanced out of the garage window. And then he saw it, far down the street, but unmistakable. The family minivan. Time seemed to slow as it approached, the sunlight glinting off its salt-streaked hood like some kind of judgmental beacon. Dom's stomach dropped. He could hear dramatic music in his head, the kind that plays during a slow-motion disaster scene in a movie. The van turned onto their street, its tires crunching over the cinder-packed road. Don stood frozen in the garage, the broken shovel still in his hand. He knew he had mere seconds to act. He grabbed a broom, because that seemed like a good thing to be holding, and walked out onto the driveway, doing his best to look like a man in the midst of a very important task. He half-heartedly swept at a patch of snow, though the broom was doing absolutely nothing to help. The minivan pulled into the driveway. Well, onto the narrow strip he cleared, and came to a stop with no room to spare. Dom pasted on his best welcome home smile. The minivan came to a stop with its tires perfectly aligned in the narrow strip of driveway Don had managed to clear. A sense of fleeting triumph bubbled up in his chest. He'd done just enough. That feeling lasted all of 5 seconds. The kids tried to pile out of the car, but immediately hit a snag. The door on the passenger side wouldn't open all the way, wedged awkwardly against the wall of snow that bordered Don's hastily cleared path. "Be careful," Don called out. Waving his hand like that might help. "Careful," his wife shot back, stepping out of the driver's side. She carefully maneuvered around the barely there space, closing the door with a frustrated thud. "They can't even open the doors properly, Don." The kids clambered out on the driver's side, each squeezing through the narrow gap like circus performers attempting a feat of contortion. One of them complained there was no room to move. Tommy, the youngest, got stuck halfway out before his sister yanked him free with an audible grunt. By the time everyone was standing in the driveway, Don's wife had turned her full attention to him. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at the driveway, then at the broken shovel leaning against the garage, and finally back at Don, still clutching the broom like it was some kind of proof of his effort. So, she began crossing her arms. "What's with the broom?" Don stammered, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Well, you see, it's been a day. The shovel broke. You know how flimsy that thing is. And I was going to improvise with this broom. It's a strategic approach." He nodded, as if that explanation sealed the deal. His wife raised an eyebrow, her skepticism practically radiating. "You spent the entire day doing this?" she asked, gesturing at the driveway. "What were you actually doing, Don?" Don opened his mouth, scrambling for a plausible answer, when a big snowball hit him squarely on the shoulder, sending a spray of snow down his snowsuit. Don looked around, startled, only to see his oldest daughter grinning mischievously. Another snowball already forming in her gloved hands. The tension broke like a sheet of ice cracking underfoot. Tommy squealed with laughter and bent down to scoop up a chunk of the frozen snow, while Don's wife shook her head with an exasperated smile. "Oh, you're in for it now," she said, her voice tinged with mock seriousness as she grabbed a handful of snow herself. "Wait, hold on, let's not." Don started to protest, but it was too late. A second snowball hit him, this time in the chest, and the driveway turned into a makeshift battlefield. Despite the snow being mostly iced over and not ideal for snowball fights, the family made do. They broke chunks off the hardened drifts, quickly fashioning them into lumpy projectiles. Don found himself ducking behind the car, laughing despite the sting from ice-like snowballs hitting his arms and legs. Tommy's aim was terrible, most of his snowballs landing harmlessly in the yard, but his enthusiasm made up for it. "Take that," he yelled, giggling as he launched another weak toss that fell short. Don's wife, however, had the precision of a sniper, landing a perfectly aimed shot right on his back. "That's for the driveway," she shouted, her grin widening as Don yelped. "Oh, it's on now." Don yelled, finally dropping the broom and scooping up his own handful of ice-like snow. His first throw missed by a mile, but he didn't care. For the first time all day, he wasn't thinking about the driveway, the broken shovel, or the tension he'd been bracing for. He was just having fun. By the time they all stumbled into the house, red-faced and laughing, the driveway didn't seem like such a big deal anymore. Sure, it wasn't perfect, and Don would probably hear about it again later. But for now, the family was together, the house was warm, and Don had managed to avoid complete disaster. At least until the next snowstorm. Inside, the warmth of the house was a welcome contrast to the cold chaos outside. The family shed their boots and coats in the entryway, the kids' voices filling the air with chatter about their weekend at Cousin Barry's. Don took the opportunity to slip away to the kitchen, where he rummaged through the pantry for something easy but comforting. "Soup," he muttered, pulling out a can of chicken noodle. "Soup fixes everything." He dumped it into a pot and set it on the stove, stirring occasionally as the aroma began to fill the room. It wasn't the best, but after the day he'd had, it was enough. The family gathered around the table, bowls of steaming soup in front of them. Dom slumped into his chair, feeling the exhaustion settle into his bones. His wife took a sip of her soup, then leaned back in her chair and looked at him with a curious smile. "So, Dom," she began, the tone of her voice immediately putting him on edge. "What did you do all weekend while we were snowed in at Barry's?" Don froze for half a second, the spoon halfway to his mouth. He quickly recovered, letting out a nonchalant chuckle. "Oh, you know," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "A bit of this, a bit of that, the usual stuff. Just taking care of things around here." "What things?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Just the usual stuff. Nothing too exciting." He shifted the conversation with practice ease. "But what about you guys? How was Cousin Barry's? Bet the kids had a blast, huh?" His wife eyed him suspiciously for a moment before shrugging and launching into a detailed account of their weekend. Don nodded along, occasionally interjecting with an enthusiastic wow. Or, "No kidding," as she talked about the snowball fight in Barry's yard, the epic board game marathon, and the questionable state of Barry's cooking. The kids chimed in too, their excitement making it easy for Don to keep the spotlight off himself. By the time dinner was over, Don was feeling pretty good about his deflection skills. "I'll clean up," he offered, standing up and gathering the bowls. "You guys go unpack and relax." His wife gave him a grateful smile. "Thanks, Don. I'll get the suitcases." Don busied himself at the sink, scrubbing soup residue from the bowls and humming softly to himself. He pulled it off. The driveway wasn't cleared, the shovel was broken, and the day had been a disaster. But somehow he'd survived without a full interrogation. That's when he heard it. The unmistakable sound of the TV turning on in the living room. His son Tommy's voice rang out, excited and curious. "Mummy, what's Wild Things?" Tom froze, the dish in his hand slipping back into the soapy water. He turned his head slowly, his heart sinking as he heard his wife's sharp intake of breath. "What?" she shrieked, her voice high-pitched and full of alarm. "Don, what is this movie?" The sound of hurried footsteps followed, and Don's instincts kicked in. He dropped the sponge, bolted for the entryway, and wrestled himself into his still wet snowsuit with the speed of a man fleeing for his life. His boots were only half on as he yanked open the front door and stumbled outside, the cold air biting at his face. Behind him, he could hear his wife yelling something unintelligible, but he didn't stop to listen. He trudged into the snow, pulling his hood over his head and muttering to himself, "Nope, not dealing with this." And with that, Don disappeared into snowy suburbs. Legend has it, Don is still out there somewhere, wandering the land, clutching his broken shovel, and muttering lines from Wild Things to himself. Some say there have been sightings of him in seedy hotels, flipping through pay-per-view menus with a suspiciously specific interest in steamy swimming pool scenes. So, if you ever see a man darting away from a TV glowing with questionable movie choices, well, that's probably Don, still running free, but still running from his fate.